There was almost nothing left to explain what had happened to 14-year-old Justin Hocutt. A train had passed over him. Then another. His body was found on railroad tracks in Seligman, Missouri, in the early morning hours of October 10, 1999, after he had been missing for roughly a day. At first, it looked like a terrible accident. A teenager, railroad tracks, a dark night, a train moving through a small Missouri town. It was the kind of scene investigators could have explained in a single sentence. But then they noticed something that made that explanation begin to collapse. There wasn't enough blood. Not nearly enough. For a 14-year-old boy struck by a moving train, the scene didn't look the way experienced investigators expected it to look. And that raised a question that would haunt the case for decades. Was Justin actually alive when he reached those tracks? Or had somebody already hurt him somewhere else? There was another problem. Justin had not simply wandered onto those railroad tracks. He had been seen alive approximately 24 hours earlier, and the person who saw him was someone who lived next door. Someone who knew Justin. Someone whose family lived inside the home where Justin had reportedly spent the early morning hours. According to the accounts later gathered by investigators, Justin had been found inside that residence with a 16-year-old girl. Her father was furious. Justin was told to leave. He was reportedly chased out, and then he disappeared. This is Cold Crime Chronicless, where we uncover cold cases. Like and subscribe to this channel for more cold case updates. His home was only about 100 yards away. He should have been able to walk there in minutes. He never arrived. Instead, nearly a day later, his body was found on the railroad tracks. And the people who lived in that neighboring home would become central to the investigation. For years, investigators and former officials would point back toward that house. They would talk about an abandoned laundromat nearby. They would talk about blood. They would talk about a pair of boots. They would talk about interviews that were conducted, witnesses who were frightened, and information that allegedly never made it into the original reports in enough detail to build a prosecution. And they would talk about a teenage girl who, according to one former investigator, eventually provided information about what had happened that night. But there was a problem. She had a history that prosecutors at the time believed could damage her credibility, so the information did not become the courtroom breakthrough investigators needed. And Justin's family waited, then waited some more. Years became decades. The case became one of those cold cases that seemed destined to remain frozen forever. Until 2025, and then 2026. A new sheriff's administration went back through the old files. Not just the highlights, not just the summaries. Everything. Reports, evidence, witnesses, old investigative leads, and the gaps left behind by an investigation conducted in an era when forensic technology was nowhere near what it is today. Investigators began interviewing people again. They began reconstructing the timeline. They brought in the Missouri State Highway Patrol, and they discovered something deeply troubling. Some people were still afraid to talk. According to investigators, members of the Scott family had been known in the Seligman community to be troublemakers, and some potential witnesses reportedly feared retaliation. Then, in July 2026, nearly 27 years after Justin Hocutt died, 3 men were arrested. Mark Wesley Scott, Bobby Ray Scott, David Ray Scott. They were charged with first-degree murder, and according to authorities, they were not strangers who suddenly appeared in the case after 27 years. They were people investigators had looked at before. People who had been connected to the house where Justin was last seen. People who had been identified as suspects early in the original investigation. The case had come full circle. But there is one thing we have to remember before going any further. An arrest is not a conviction. A criminal charge is an allegation. All 3 men are presumed innocent unless proven guilty in court. And because the case is now moving through the legal system, some details remain sealed, restricted, or undisclosed. But that does not make the story less disturbing. In some ways, it makes it more disturbing. Because Justin's death was never simply about what happened on a railroad track. It was about what may have happened before he ever reached those tracks. It was about a 14-year-old boy who was last seen alive at a house next door to his own. And it was about a question that remained unanswered for almost 3 decades. Who put Justin Hocutt on those tracks? To understand why Justin's death became such a mystery, you have to understand how ordinary his life was supposed to be. Justin Hocutt was 14 years old. He had recently moved to Seligman, Missouri, after previously living in Arkansas. Seligman is a small community in Berry County, in southwestern Missouri, not far from the Arkansas state line. It is the kind of place where distances are short, and communities can be tightly connected. Justin had only been in town for a few months. He lived with his father, Timothy Hocutt, and his paternal grandparents. and directly next door was another household. That neighboring home would become the center of the investigation. Harold Lee Johnson lived there. Johnson was 40 years old at the time of the events, according to contemporary accounts, and was acquainted with Justin's father. Johnson's teenage daughter, Katrina, also lived there. So did Brenda Scott, Johnson's girlfriend, and Brenda's sons. Among those sons were Bobby Ray Scott and Wesley Scott. David Scott would also later be identified by authorities as one of the 3 men charged in Justin's death. The relationships are important, because this wasn't a crime involving strangers passing through town. These people lived close together. Some knew one another. Some were connected through family. And according to investigators, the events of that early October morning began inside the Johnson-Scott residence. The story starts with Justin and Katrina. According to the accounts later given to investigators, Justin had been inside the apartment during the early morning hours. At approximately 3 or 4 in the morning, Harold Johnson discovered Justin and his daughter together. Contemporary accounts vary slightly on the precise time, but the essential detail remains consistent. Justin was inside the neighboring residence. He was with Katrina, and Harold Johnson was angry. According to investigators, Justin was told to leave. Some accounts say he was chased out of the house. Johnson later told investigators that he woke Justin and told him to leave, and that Justin left without an argument. That version of events would become extremely important. Because if Justin simply walked out of the house alive, where did he go? His own home was next door. He should have been there almost immediately, but he wasn't. Instead, his trail seemingly disappeared for nearly a day. Then came the railroad tracks, and with them came the first version of the story. Maybe Justin had walked onto the tracks. Maybe he had been disoriented. Maybe he had been intoxicated. Maybe he had taken his own life. Those possibilities had to be considered. Investigators couldn't simply declare murder because the scene looked strange. But toxicology would eventually eliminate one of the simplest explanations. Justin had no alcohol or drugs in his system. That mattered. Because if someone wanted to explain why a 14-year-old had wandered onto active railroad tracks in the middle of the night, intoxication would have been an obvious possibility. The toxicology results did not support it. Then investigators began looking at the physical scene. Justin had been struck by a southbound train, but according to former investigators, another train later struck his body as well. The damage was catastrophic. That made it difficult to determine what had happened before the train reached him. The railroad itself had effectively become a machine that destroyed evidence. But not all evidence disappeared. Blood remained, and the amount of blood became one of the most important questions in the entire case. Former Berry County coroner Skip White later explained that he had worked numerous railroad deaths. He knew what a train could do to a human body, and he knew there should have been substantial blood at the point of impact. But there wasn't enough. That observation contributed to his conclusion that Justin's death was a homicide. Another former sheriff, Mick Epperly, reached a similar conclusion. According to Epperly, there was some blood at the point where the train struck Justin, but not the amount investigators expected if the train had been the event that actually killed him. The implication was chilling. The tracks might not have been the scene of the murder. They might have been the disposal site. And if that was true, then someone had taken a 14-year-old boy's body and carried or dragged it to the railroad tracks. The question became, why? Why would anyone do that? The obvious answer was to make the death look accidental. And if the murderers could convince investigators that Justin had wandered onto the tracks, they could potentially turn a homicide into a tragic railroad accident. But the investigators had another problem. The railroad tracks were close to the house where Justin had last been seen. Very close. His body was found roughly 300 feet from the Johnson-Scott residence, and his own home was approximately 100 yards away. The place where Justin disappeared, and the place where he was found, were practically neighbors. That proximity made the case even stranger. If Justin had simply left the apartment, why didn't he go home? If he had walked toward the railroad tracks, why? If he was alive, why didn't anyone see him during the next 24 hours? And if he was already dead, who carried him there? Those questions would follow investigators for years. Rewinding the hand of time to Missouri, 1999, it is the early morning hours in a small Missouri town. Most people are asleep. The streets are quiet. The railroad tracks are nearby. And inside a residence next door to Justin's home, a father discovers his teenage daughter with a 14-year-old boy. That moment may have been the spark. What happened next is where this story begins, because we don't have a complete recording of those minutes. According to former investigator Mick Epperly, Justin was discovered in the residence with Harold Johnson's daughter. Epperly believed this was the beginning of a confrontation. His theory was that Johnson became angry and involved Brenda Scott's sons. The Scott brothers were adults at the time. They were significantly older than Justin, and according to investigators, they became central suspects almost immediately. But there is an important distinction. The theory that Justin was beaten inside the house is not the same as saying a court has established that fact. In the newly filed criminal case, the three Scott brothers are now formally accused of first-degree murder. They have denied involvement, according to authorities. The truth will ultimately have to be tested in court. But one detail kept coming back. Justin had been seen alive at the residence. Then he vanished. Then, his body appeared on the tracks. That is the central gap. The missing journey between the house and the railroad. And that gap became the territory where investigators searched for answers. One of the most disturbing pieces of the old investigation involved a vacant apartment near the Johnson Scott residence. Former investigators said they used luminol in that apartment. Luminol can reveal possible traces of blood that are not visible to the eye. The investigators reportedly observed reactions consistent with blood. But there was not enough material to conduct the kind of testing they would have wanted. And because this was 1999, the technology available to investigators was far more limited than what modern investigators have at their disposal. There was also the issue of a pair of boots. According to former officials and family accounts, investigators seized boots associated with one of the Scott brothers. Blood was reportedly observed on or associated with the boots. Years later, questions remained about how the evidence had been handled and what could still be recovered. That is one of the painful realities of old cases. A clue can exist. A clue can even be collected. But if the investigation does not know exactly what the clue means at the time, the clue may never become the answer. And there was another problem: fear. In small communities, information doesn't always disappear because nobody knows. Sometimes it disappears because people are afraid to speak. Investigators in 2026 specifically said fear had been an obstacle. Missouri State Highway Patrol Master Sergeant J.L. Mason said witnesses had been afraid to come forward. He described the Scott family as having been part of the Seligman community for a long time and said some individuals were afraid of them. That fear may help explain why this case sat unresolved for a long time, even when investigators believed people knew what happened. You don't need a perfect crime scene if nobody is willing to talk. And you don't need a perfect witness if that witness believes telling the truth could put their own family in danger. That was one of the barriers investigators faced. But there was one witness whose story became particularly important: Katrina Johnson, the teenage girl who had been with Justin. According to former investigators, she initially did not want to talk. She was frightened. She was dealing with the trauma of what had happened. And investigators later said she feared retaliation. Eventually, however, she did provide information. According to former investigator Mick Epperly, she eventually gave investigators an account and signed an affidavit that was submitted to the prosecutor's office. But the affidavit never resulted in murder charges at the time. The prosecutor questioned her credibility, but in 1999, the prosecution did not move forward, and the case remained stuck. The discovery of Justin's body was horrifying, but the horror of the scene also created one of the greatest problems investigators would face. A railroad train had already destroyed much of the physical evidence. Justin's body had reportedly been struck by more than one train. The first train was traveling south. A second train later traveled north and struck the body. The result was a crime scene unlike almost any other. The body was severely damaged. Some remains were displaced, and the railroad environment itself made reconstruction extraordinarily difficult. Former officials later said that some parts of the body were missing or moved by animals. The crime scene photographs also became a problem. According to investigators involved in the later review, the photographic equipment and quality available in 1999 were not comparable to today's technology. Some of the original photographs did not turn out well, and that meant that a scene that investigators desperately needed to preserve visually was partially lost. But one thing survived in the investigators' memories: the blood didn't make sense. Former coroner Skip White had worked on train deaths before. His conclusion was that Justin had not been killed by the train. Former Sheriff Mick Epperly reached the same basic conclusion. The railroad tracks were not behaving like the scene of a normal train fatality. The amount of blood was wrong, and that was enough to transform the case. What had looked like an accident became a suspected homicide. The tracks were no longer simply where Justin died. They might have been where someone tried to hide how he died. But then came another question. If Justin had been dead before the train struck him, how long had he been dead? The timeline became critical. Justin was last seen alive around 3 in the morning. His body was discovered approximately 22 to 24 hours later. That is a very long gap. and investigators needed to know whether Justin could have been alive somewhere during that period, or whether he died shortly after being thrown out of the apartment. The old investigation struggled with that question. Former coroner Skip White later discussed rigor mortis and the difficulty of determining the precise time of death under such circumstances. The train trauma made everything more complicated. The body had suffered catastrophic injuries. That meant conventional observations about the condition of the body were harder to interpret. 90% of you watching are yet to subscribe. If you support the work we do here, hit the subscribe button right now. It is what helps us to grow. For years, some investigators believed Justin had been killed somewhere near the Johnson Scott residence and later moved. One location repeatedly mentioned was the vacant laundromat. It sat close to the apartment. Investigators reportedly believed Justin may have been taken there. They used luminol. They found reactions consistent with blood, but there was not enough usable material to establish the identity of the blood. And again, the evidence stopped just short of becoming the answer. However, in 2026, investigators had to do something that had not been done adequately enough in 1999. They had to turn suspicion into a prosecutable case. The original investigation was not simply a story of police doing nothing. That would be unfair. Investigators did interview witnesses. They followed leads. They conducted examinations. Railroad police became involved because the body had been found on railroad property, and investigators eventually became convinced that Justin's death was not an accident. But decades later, officials acknowledged serious weaknesses. Missouri State Highway Patrol Master Sergeant J.L. Mason said investigators in 2026 essentially had to start from square one. They went back to previous witnesses. They interviewed people who had previously been considered suspects. They reviewed old information. They attempted to reconstruct the case from the ground up. And one of the most significant observations came from Mason himself. He said the original investigation had been led by railroad police because the body was found on the tracks. In his view, this was not necessarily the type of homicide that should have been primarily investigated by a railroad agency. That may have contributed to the problems that followed. The first investigators were dealing with what appeared to be a railroad death. And when a scene is initially interpreted as an accident, investigators can unknowingly preserve the wrong evidence and ask the wrong questions. The distinction matters. If you believe someone was struck by a train while alive, you look for one kind of evidence. If you suspect someone was murdered elsewhere and placed on the tracks, you look for something completely different. In Justin's case, the investigation had to change direction. But by the time that happened, some of the most important evidence had already been damaged or lost. The scene had been exposed. The trains had passed. The body had been severely damaged. The photographs were imperfect. And witnesses were not always interviewed with the level of detail modern investigators would expect. There was another complication. People were connected. 9 people were reportedly in or around the apartment building during the relevant period, according to historical reporting. That meant the investigation was not dealing with one isolated suspect. It was dealing with a network of people who knew one another. And that created another challenge. Who knew what? Who saw Justin? Who heard something? Who was inside the residence? Who left? Who went to work? Who had an alibi? Who changed their story? And who was too frightened to say anything? Investigators used voice stress analysis and polygraph examinations on some people connected to the case. Historical reporting indicated that several individuals did not pass those tests. But polygraphs are not substitutes for physical evidence or courtroom proof. They may guide an investigation, but they do not establish guilt. Still, they helped investigators narrow their focus. And over time, that focus repeatedly returned to the same group: the Johnsons, the Scotts, the house next door, the girl who had been with Justin, and the unanswered question of what happened after Justin was forced out. The years after Justin's murder were not quiet for his family. It never became history. Justin's aunts continued searching for answers. They spoke publicly about the case. They remembered the questions. They remembered the rumors. And they remembered how close the suspected location was to Justin's own home. There were also allegations of disturbing behavior after Justin's death. Family members later said the Johnsons and Scotts continued living nearby. They reported incidents of harassment. They described gunfire directed toward their family's home. They said people yelled over the fence and made comments about what had happened to Justin. These are allegations reported by family members, not proven findings of a court. But they demonstrate how tense the relationship became. For Justin's relatives, the pain was not simply that they had lost a child. It was that the people they believed might know the truth remained close, and the case remained unresolved. In 2005, Berry County announced a renewed effort involving a multi-jurisdictional task force. The goal was to revisit Justin's murder. Again, investigators believed the case could be solved. Again, it wasn't. Then came another generation of investigators, and eventually, another sheriff. Danny Boyd had been elected sheriff in 2020. According to Boyd, people asked him almost immediately whether he would reopen the Hocutt case. He said yes. In the fall of 2025, investigators began a comprehensive re-examination. They went through the old reports. They reviewed evidence. They revisited witnesses. And they looked for the places where the original investigation had failed to answer basic questions. Then came February 2026. The Barry County Sheriff's Office asked the Missouri State Highway Patrol for assistance. The reason was practical. Some people connected to the case were living outside Missouri. The local investigators needed help reaching them. The Highway Patrol became involved, and the case was rebuilt, not as a story, as an investigation. The breakthrough did not arrive with a dramatic DNA match announced on television. But at the July 2026 press conference, Master Sergeant J.L. Mason said he was not aware of DNA evidence playing a role in the new case in the way people might assume. Instead, investigators relied heavily on something far older than DNA: statements, reconstruction, and inconsistencies. Investigators went back to people who had been questioned 27 years earlier. They compared what people remembered with what had previously been documented. They reconstructed the timeline, and they found information that prosecutors believed was enough to establish probable cause. Then the arrests came. 3 brothers: Mark Wesley Scott, Bobby Ray Scott, David Ray Scott. David Ray Scott. All 3 were charged with first-degree murder. Authorities allege that Justin was fatally assaulted before his body was placed on the railroad tracks. That is the central accusation in the current case. David Scott was taken into custody in Missouri. Mark and Bobby Scott were arrested in Arkansas. Their extradition situations were different. Mark waived extradition. Bobby did not. The prosecutor's office said it would pursue a governor's warrant for Bobby's extradition. David was being held in Barry County without bond pending further proceedings. And then came another remarkable detail. When asked about the men's reactions to the accusations, Sheriff Boyd said the 2 he was personally aware of denied involvement. That is significant, because the case is now moving from investigation into litigation. The investigators can no longer simply say, "We think this is what happened." They must prove it. The most fascinating development came during the July 28th press conference. A reporter asked about the blood. The question went directly to one of the biggest contradictions in the case. For years, investigators had pointed to the lack of blood on the tracks as evidence that Justin was already dead before he was placed there. But the current probable cause statement contained a very different conclusion. According to that document, the doctor who reviewed the autopsy determined that Justin was alive when he was placed on the railroad tracks and struck by the train. That changes the narrative dramatically. If the current medical conclusion is correct, then Justin may have been assaulted elsewhere, transported to the tracks while still alive, and then struck by the train. That would mean the tracks were not merely a place where a dead body was abandoned. They may have been the final stage of the killing itself. And that raises a horrifying possibility. Justin could have been alive when someone placed him on those rails. Alive when the train approached. Alive when the headlights appeared. Alive when there was no way to escape. But investigators have not released enough evidence publicly to reconstruct exactly how that happened. And because the defendants have not been convicted, we cannot fill those gaps with imagination. We have to leave them as questions. What injuries did Justin suffer before he reached the tracks? Who caused those injuries? Who transported him? Was he carried? Dragged? Did more than one person move him? How was he positioned? And what was the purpose? Was the intent to kill him? Or was the railroad supposed to conceal an assault that had already gone too far? These are not minor questions. They are the difference between knowing a crime happened and understanding the crime. The 3 men now charged were adults in 1999. According to the July 2026 press conference, Mark Scott was born in 1980, Bobby Scott in 1978, and David Scott in 1977. That means they were adults when Justin was 14. And according to current authorities, they were stepbrothers to Justin's girlfriend. That relationship is critical, because it puts them directly inside the social circle surrounding the residence where Justin was last seen. But again, a relationship is not proof of murder. The prosecution still has to establish what each man allegedly did. That distinction matters. A group accusation does not automatically prove that all 3 people committed the same acts. The state must establish individual criminal responsibility. And the fact that investigators charged all three suggests that prosecutors believe the evidence supports their involvement. For the first time in nearly 27 years, the people investigators now accused of killing Justin have been formally placed into the criminal justice system. But justice and conviction are not the same thing. The trial, if the case reaches that stage, will determine what can actually be proven. Several of the people who were central to the original investigation are no longer alive. Harold Johnson died. Brenda Scott died. That means two people who were reportedly inside the residence where Justin was last seen cannot be brought into a courtroom to answer questions. Despite the loss of time, investigators still had living witnesses. And they still had the three Scott brothers. But there remains another painful absence. Justin himself. He was 14. He had only been in Seligman for a short period. His life was barely beginning. He would have grown up. He would have turned 15, then 16, 17, 18. He might have graduated. He might have worked. He might have married. He might have had children. He might have become someone his younger self could never have imagined. All of those possibilities ended on a railroad track. That is what Justin's aunt meant when she said the loss was bigger than the death itself. When someone kills a child, the victim loses a future that can never be recovered. There are no adult memories of Justin. No career. No family. No older version of him. Only photographs, memories, and questions. For 27 years, Justin's family lived with uncertainty. There was no conviction, no courtroom ending, no definitive answer, only theories. Some family members believed Justin was killed because of conflicts involving some claims. Former investigators believed the motive was more directly connected to Justin's relationship with Katrina Johnson. There were rumors about what happened to Justin's body. There were stories about a dryer. There were claims about blood. There were questions about boots. There were accusations of intimidation. There were conflicting accounts. And there were investigators who believed they knew who was responsible but could not get the case into court. As of the end of July 2026, there has been no trial. There has been no conviction. And there has been no final judicial determination of guilt. David Scott was being held in Berry County and had a bond hearing scheduled for August 11, 2026. Mark Scott was arrested in Arkansas and had waived extradition. Bobby Scott did not waive extradition, requiring Missouri authorities to pursue the additional legal process needed to bring him back. These procedural details may seem small compared with the horror of Justin's death, but they are important. Because this is now a criminal case, the prosecution has to prove its allegations. The defense will have an opportunity to challenge the evidence. Witnesses may be questioned. Old statements may be attacked. New statements may be challenged. Physical evidence may be examined. And the court will ultimately decide what evidence can be admitted and what conclusions can legally be drawn from it. There is one image that has remained at the center of this case for almost 3 decades. A railroad track, a 14-year-old boy, and a town that had to live with the knowledge that someone knew more than they were saying. Maybe the most haunting part is the distance. Justin's home was so close. He wasn't hundreds of miles from safety. He wasn't lost in a forest. He wasn't kidnapped from a highway. He was found roughly 100 yards from the home where he lived, and only about 300 feet from the residence where he was last seen alive. That means the answer to the case may have been sitting within a few minutes' walk of his front door. For 27 years, the railroad tracks became the symbol of the case. But perhaps they shouldn't be. Because the tracks may not have been where the story began. They may have been where someone tried to end it. And the most important location may have been the house next door. The house where Justin was reportedly found with Katrina. The house where an argument began. The house investigators repeatedly returned to. The house associated with the men now charged. And the house connected to the missing hours between Justin's last known sighting and the discovery of his body. Those missing hours are the heart of the mystery. What happened after Justin was told to leave? Did he ever make it outside? Did someone follow him? Did he return? Was he taken somewhere? Was he assaulted? Who was present? Who heard something? Who saw something? And who decided that the railroad tracks were the answer? For years, those questions had no courtroom. Now they do. 27 years is almost an entire lifetime for some people. And yet, somehow, Justin's case survived. His name survived. His family's questions survived. The investigation survived. And eventually, the case moved again. In July 2026, Sheriff Danny Boyd stood before reporters and made something clear. Time does not erase responsibility. That idea may be the most fitting ending to Justin's story. Because time did not erase him. It did not erase the questions. It did not erase the evidence. It did not erase the people who remembered that night. And it did not erase the possibility of justice. But justice is not simply putting handcuffs on 3 men after 27 years. Justice requires truth. And truth requires evidence. The arrests are a beginning, not an ending. The 3 men accused of killing Justin will have their day in court. The prosecution will have to prove its case. And if the allegations are proven, the court will determine the punishment. But regardless of what happens next, one fact cannot be changed. Justin Hocutt was 14 years old when his life ended. His body was found on railroad tracks in Seligman, Missouri. His death was initially treated as something that might have been an accident. Then investigators realized it was something else, a homicide. For years, the case remained unsolved. And for years, the question remained, who put Justin on those tracks? Today, we finally have 3 names attached to that question. Mark Wesley Scott, Bobby Ray Scott, David Ray Scott. But a name on an arrest document is not the same thing as a verdict. The courtroom must now decide what happened. And perhaps, after 27 years, that is exactly where Justin's story belongs. Not in rumor, not in speculation, not in whispers behind fences, but in evidence, in testimony, and, finally, in a place where the truth can be tested. Because on that October morning in 1999, Justin Hocutt had no opportunity to tell his story. For almost 3 decades, everyone else had to tell it for him. Now the case has been reopened. The suspects have been arrested, and the investigation remains active. Some witnesses are finally talking. Some evidence is being examined again. And somewhere in the records, statements, memories, and unanswered questions surrounding a tiny Missouri town, investigators believe the truth is still there. Waiting. 27 years after a 14-year-old boy disappeared from the space between one house and another. The question is no longer simply whether Justin Hocutt was murdered. Authorities now allege that he was. The question is whether the evidence will finally reveal exactly how, why, and who was responsible. And after nearly 3 decades of silence, that answer may finally be closer than it has ever been. Justin Hocutt was 14 years old. He should have gone home. He never did. And the railroad tracks where his body was found may have concealed the truth for 27 years. But they did not take it with them. The case is alive again. And this time, the people who investigators say know what happened are being brought before the court. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel.